univocity, I mean, if you break it down etymologically, it's a one voice, so the idea here is sameness in meaning. So when I say, um, uh, you know, I am a man and you are a man, we're of course two different men, but I'm using the word man in exactly the same way both times. You know? So the meanings are univocal. It's the meanings of each occurrence of the word man is univocal. So now think about uh, a case where we talk about God. We can say that Thomas is wise and God is wise. Now, in that case, are we using the word wise in each occurrence in the same way, in a different way, or in a somewhat different, somewhat same way? Now, Scotus thinks that we do have a concept of wisdom that really does apply to God, and it's the same concept that applies to human beings who are wise, or angels who are wise. Now, Scotus thinks God is simple and God is infinite, so his wisdom is infinite, and he's related to his wisdom by identity rather than contingently as an accident. Nevertheless, God is wise, not in the same degree that humans are wise. He's not related to his wisdom the same way that we are if we're wise. But nevertheless, wisdom in God means the same thing as it means in us, despite those differences. That's what Scotus says. Now, the Thomists, following St. Thomas himself, say that the word wisdom as applied to God can't mean exactly the same thing as it means when we use it to talk about wise angels or wise human beings. And what's the reason for this? The primary reason is supposed to be that God is related to wisdom by identity. And so when we use the word God, when we use the word wise or wisdom to describe God, we are, in a sense, signifying the whole divine essence. Right? And so the word wisdom takes on this signification that it can never take on when we are using that very term to talk about creatures who are wise or could be wise. And so that vast metaphysical difference between the way that God is related to wisdom and the way that humans are related to wisdom, for Aquinas is sufficient for him to deny that they mean the same thing. So now what do you do with that? So he rejects univocity in that sense. So then what does he do? He can't say that they mean totally different things, because then when we call God wise, we literally wouldn't know what we're talking about. So instead he settles on his famous theory of analogy, that there is some unity of meaning between wisdom as applied to humans and wisdom as applied to God. But there is also this great difference, and the unity of meaning preserves the intelligibility. We do kind of know what we're talking about, but there's so much more that transcends what we know what we're talking about when we use these terms to talk about God. So that's the theory of analogy.
So when Scotus says that these terms mean the same thing applied to us and to God, is there a way that he preserves the sort of transcendence and mystery of God with regard to, the difference between God and man?
Yeah, I really do. I really do think he does. He's often accused of failing to preserve this. People have read what he has to say about univocity, and they've concluded, he thinks that God is wise, or God is love, or God is a being in the same way that creatures are. And so there's this flattening of the ontological gap between God and creatures. Now, what I think is actually the case about Scotus is that he has a very robust metaphysical understanding of the vast difference between God and creatures. He emphasizes God's infinity and God's simplicity. And if you think of God as simple, any attribute that God has is identical with every other attribute and is identical with God himself. And if you think of God as infinite, then all of these attributes, which are really the same as each other, are possessed by God in an infinite way. So there is this vast difference. God is also the original source or exemplar of all of these ways of being. So God's love and God's wisdom are the exemplar of love and wisdom. There isn't a Platonic entity of wisdom out there that God and creatures share in. So I really do think that that metaphysical difference is there for Scotus as much as it is for Aquinas. But that metaphysical difference for Scotus does not have much of an impact on how he theorizes about the meaning of the words that we use to talk about God and creatures. So what he might say is that to Aquinas, if, so to speak, they had been speaking back and forth to each other, they didn't, of course, because Scotus was only 9 years old when Aquinas died. So this wasn't a debate that Aquinas and Scotus were directly engaged in. But if we imagine them speaking to each other, we could imagine Scotus saying something like, Brother Thomas, I grant that God is identical with his wisdom, and so what wisdom signifies when we use it to God, when we apply it to God, is the whole of the divine essence. I grant that that's the metaphysical situation that we're involved in when we try to talk about God. But still I hold, nevertheless, that the meaning of the word remains the same. And that's important for philosophical theology. After all, as both Aquinas and Scotus agree, what we do in philosophical theology or natural theology is try to reason from facts about creation to facts about God. And that reasoning, insofar as it is deductive, requires stable meanings of terms. And interestingly, when Aquinas offers his theory of analogy, one of the things that he tells us is that the words that we use to talk about God must have a sufficiently unified meaning with the words that we use to talk about creatures in order to preserve validity in arguments from creatures to God. Now, of course, for Aquinas, that's not enough for him to adopt a univocity theory. But then Scotus comes along and he says exactly the same thing about the importance of preserving stability of terms across deductive reasoning. And he offers that as the main reason for holding a theory of the univocity of language about God. So on my own hope is that Aquinas and Scotus are actually compatible on this issue, and that some of the confusion is exactly how each thinker understands the relationship between metaphysics and what we might call semantics. And also, I think that Aquinas and Scotus understand the very term univocity in slightly different ways. So I think that what Aquinas is rejecting when he rejects univocity is not what Scotus is embracing when he accepts univocity. But I'm sure in heaven the two have gotten together and have worked out whatever substantive disagreements they have. And my hope is that they would recognize that this one, anyway, was a merely verbal disagreement.